Hey, this is Ron Coddington from Military Images Magazine, coming to you from magazine headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Very pleased to be with all of you tonight. And this is the first time we've been on in a month. We skipped our last program to take a little bit of a summer break and also to give me some time to prepare for an appearance on Will Griffing's Civil War Digital Digest. So absolutely delighted to be with all of you tonight. So we're going to wait for a minute or two to let folks start coming on. I see Gilbert Sorrell is here from Georgia. How are you doing tonight, sir? Mom is here. How are you doing, Mom? Glad to have you. Jim is here. Rick Wolf is here. Very, very pleased to have all of you with us this evening. And while we're waiting for folks to gather, because it takes a few minutes to get here, you've got to crank up your Facebook. I'll show off the cover of our current issue, the summer issue, which came out early in June. And I'm delighted to have this image from the collection of Dan Schwab on the cover. Absolutely wonderful photograph. And of course, inside you'll find 3 Days in July, which has collections, stories, and photographs of soldiers who were at Gettysburg. And a big, big thanks to Chuck Joyce, because he was the editor who helped find images, do the research. Super, super helpful in all that he did. I cannot thank him enough, and all of those who contributed. I also want to mention that I had a few questions over a short period of time about the plastic enclosure that the magazine comes in. So for those of you who get the home delivery, let me put it this way, we have the mailing card in the back, of course, the cover on the front, and it's sealed in this plastic, this nice plastic cover. And folks were asking me, what is this? What is this plastic? This feels pretty good. It's pretty solid stuff. And so I want to remind everybody that this is actual archival plastic. It has passed the photographic activity test. Here's the seal of approval for the PAT. Those of you who watched or attended our DC Civil War talks back in February may have listened to Rachel Wetzel talk. She's a conservator over at the Library of Congress, talked about polypropylene, which is a great way to store your photographs and paper items and magazines. So this archival plastic, it's like 100% polypropylene. It's 100% archival safe. It's 100% everything good as far as plastic and archival materials are concerned. So the next time you get your issue, don't throw the plastic away. You can keep it. You can do a couple things with it. When you're finished with the magazine, if you want to store it, you can put it in this envelope and put it back. It has a very easy top that peels off across the top. Or if you don't want to use it for the magazine, you can use it for paper, you can use it for photographs, anything that you want to protect and keep safe, you can reuse this plastic bag. And I'm informed by the owners of the company who make this plastic that it can take all kinds of bumps and bruises in the mail, and it's not going to damage the chemical properties of this plastic. So polypropylene archival envelopes. If you're looking for another reason to subscribe, well, the plastic envelope, keep it in mind. Anyway, speaking of covers of military images, I want to take you back to the summer of 2016. Pardon me. We did a whole issue about Zouaves, and one of the stories, in fact, the main story, was a gallery of images called Natty Glory. And it was highlights of the collection of Dan Miller. Well, Dan has an absolutely amazing collection. And I had the opportunity to see it in Mansfield, Ohio at the Civil War Show, probably back in 2014, 2015, made a bunch of scans. Dan and I worked closely together to produce this piece. Dan at the time was working on a book. That was his end game, a goal to get this book together. And so some of the images that we included in the gallery in Military Images are now part of this big, thick book. I need some help carrying it. It's so heavy. American Zouaves, 1859 to 1959, in Illustrated History, and there's Dan's name. I got to tell you, this book, as Ron Field talked about in the review he did in the current issue, it's amazing. It is probably the single best source for information on Zouaves that I've seen anywhere. It's documented. Well, I haven't counted them, but I'm sure Dan has. There's so many organizations that are documented in this book. I can't say enough good things about it. It's an expensive book, I'll warn you, but it's also one that I really recommend if you're interested in Zouave images or if you're looking for essential reference books for your bookshelf. So American Zouaves, 1859, 1959, I'm covering up Dan's name, Daniel J. Miller. Go to Amazon or your favorite bookstore and get a copy. So thanks to Dan for all of his help. So, like many of you, I've watched television the last few weeks. I've seen the pictures of George Floyd and so many others who have been killed, injured, suffered death, suffered pain and suffering, suffering all kinds of pain. And those images are indelibly etched in my brain. It also called to mind many of the soldiers that I researched back in 2010, 2011 for my book, African American Faces of the Civil War. And the faces, the stories of these men kept passing through my mind over the past weeks, intertwined with the modern faces of people today. And there's one face from the Civil War period that kept coming back to me. And to start, I want to take you to April 23rd, 1861, in Brooklyn, New York, where the 13th New York National Guard is headed south. 1,000 muskets strong. They're dressed in their gray flannel uniforms and have their muskets. And they're marching through Brooklyn. Crowds are cheering. Throngs are in the streets cheering on the soldiers. We're a little more than a week and a half after Fort Sumter. So the war fever is burning bright. The romance of war is burning bright. And these young men and their officers are headed off to the south for what they expect to be a short war. There's a lot of information. If you go into newspapers, you'll find documented evidence about the parade through Brooklyn, a band playing Old Lang Syne as they marched, proud young men walking through town. What they don't mention is a number of other men who went with those soldiers south. Men of color who did not have the opportunity to be in uniform that day. And so one of those men is here. This is Alexander Heritage Newton. He is a former slave. He's escaped and made his way to New York. He could not be a soldier, but he could be attached to the army. Not exactly sure in which way he was attached, servant to an officer, some other sort of a laborer. In this case, he heads off to the army, with the army down south. And many years later, in 1904, he writes his autobiography called Out of the Briars, which is the title of this segment. And in his autobiography, he has a lot to say about those early days of slavery. One thing he said, he articulates his early years. He says, "I was born under the regime of slavery, a free child, my mother being a free woman. My father was a slave, so that in my family, I learned what slavery was." So he was from an interesting situation where it was half slave and half not. "I felt its curse in my bones, and I longed for an opportunity and the power to play a Moses on behalf of my people. I suppose," he adds, "this was a dream of every child born into slavery." During his childhood, he was in New Bern, North Carolina. He says, "As a mere child, I looked out upon the world as beautiful, so beautiful, and felt that all men and women were good and kind. I did not know of the distinctions, classes, conditions, and grades of mankind. But as I grew older, these distinctions were forced upon my tender heart and burned into my mind. I gradually came to the realization of my sad condition, though free, and the sad condition of my race." So that's his early years. When he escapes and heads up north and eventually lands in New York, when the war comes, as I mentioned, he attaches himself to the 13th New York National Guard, heads down south, and he comes back when the 13th term of enlistment is expired. He gets home back to New York. Not too long after that event of his return is another event, the draft riots of 1863. He's caught up in all that. He's chased through the streets, hunted through the streets. He manages to escape, and he's forced to flee town and tries to find some safe haven lands in Connecticut. And there in Connecticut, he finds not only a home in the state, but he also finds a home in the 29th Connecticut Infantry, which is how he looks here. This is him in his uniform. He's able to realize his dream. He couldn't do it in 1861 with the 13th, but he could do it later in the war with the 29th. Here he is as a quartermaster sergeant. Here's that entire carte de visite. He's with his friend, another quartermaster sergeant, Daniel Lathrop. So Daniel and Alexander Heritage Newton, they go back down south. They go to South Carolina. And in South Carolina, Alexander has more experiences as a soldier for the first time. He also realizes what wearing the uniform does for him. He says, "I was in the full realization of what it meant to begin in the South, not a cringing black man, but a proud American soldier with the Union and Old Glory behind, before, over, and under me, surrounded by Old Glory." He's worried when he gets down there about himself and what he would do. He says, "I confess I had a burning desire to eke out a vengeance, which for years had been pent up in my nature. The anger, the bitterness, years of being held down. There's a lot of anger there." He eventually held on to that anger. And here's what he says about it. "But of course, from the Christian standpoint, this was all wrong. I was all wrong. I was in a higher mission than trying to get a personal vengeance on those who mistreated me and mine. I was fighting for the liberty of my people and righting of many wrongs that belonged to their social and religious welfare. So, he was fighting for something much larger than himself. And so he did. Part of that anger that he felt was a childhood story. When he was enslaved at home, his master's home, one of the master's children came in. There was a pie on the table. There was one slice left. The child, the master's son, took that pie, scooped it up, ate it, took off. Alexander's mother was furious, and she got up to catch the child and discipline him. Alexander's father also stood up, and he grabbed his wife, Alexander's mother, to stop her, because he knew that she could be in trouble for trying to discipline the child. That story came back to Alexander's memory as he was dealing with the anger of being a soldier in South Carolina, I think it was childhood. Anyway, he contained his anger and he went on, served through the rest of the war and came home. And he eventually became a minister. He settled in Camden, New Jersey, and there lived out the rest of his life, writing his memoir, as I mentioned, Out of the Briars in 1904. So trying to make sense, at least I'll speak for myself, as I'm trying to make sense of what's going on today, I look back at the stories of these men, many of them who were completely forgotten. You hear a lot about Buffalo Soldiers, but we often forget about the 200,000 men of color who fought in the Union Army and the Union Navy. And so Out of the Briars is for me, it's an important book. It's one that I refer to every once in a while to help me understand what Alexander Heritage Newton felt. So if you get a chance, look it up. It's on Google. It's free. Just look up Out of the Briars, Newton, and you'll find it. Google Books. By the way, here's an image of Alexander Heritage Newton when the book was published. Tip of the cap, Alexander Heritage Newton, former slave, 29th Connecticut Infantry, minister in Camden, New Jersey. All righty. Take a trip down the research rabbit hole. Here's our segment. Unlikely path to a Civil War veteran. Why do I say this is unlikely? Well, it starts with this image. I picked this up a few months ago now, at least, and really caught my attention. You have this young woman. I don't think she can be more than, 13, 14, 15. And she's sitting at what turns out to be a burnishing machine. I know you want to see a close-up of it. You've got the wheel, her hand turns it, you got the rollers. This is the kind of machine that you would run an albumin through to kind of smooth it out. This is what George Whitley, someone who's been a mentor to me, George gave me the information, sort of made the surface glossy as it was burnished. So this is an interesting burnishing machine. And sitting on top of it looks like some sort of a portable rolling table that is covered with fabric. Now, on the back of this carte de visite photo, fortunately, we know the photographer, the person who took it. This is the National Photograph Gallery by A.W. Harwood of Windsor, Vermont. A nice detail. Now, Here's a close-up of that back mark. Give you a good view of it. Now, something I like to do is to check out the histories of the photographers who took the images. I was fascinated by that. These guys, these entrepreneurs at the intersection of business, art, science, photography, these harnessers of light, the guys who made these images that we've become the caretakers of. What's their story? I'm always interested, and I'll poke around a little bit and try to find out. So I did a search. One of my go-to places when I'm searching for someone I don't really know much about is Newspaperscom to see what I can see. And sure enough, one of the first hits I get is this one. It's a small article. It says Albert Harwood of Brattleboro, Vermont has just celebrated his 98th birthday. It's from, I think, 1928. And it gives a very brief description of him. Talks about him being a photographer, working in the paper mill. Oh, and by the way, it mentions he was a Civil War soldier. Now, that's an interesting detail. I don't come across that many photographers who were also Civil War soldiers. They're out there, and you probably know of some. But here's one that I wasn't familiar with. A.W. Harwood, and now we know his first name is Albert. So Albert W. Harwood, Civil War soldier, in addition to his role as a photographer. Later on, he becomes a violin maker. So he has maybe a musical streak going on there. So now that I know this information, I look around a little bit more, and sure enough, I find his obituary. Here he is. Harwood dies, war veteran, 99. This is 1929, I believe. And look at the deck of this headline, wounded at Gettysburg, long employed in paper mills. So now we're beginning to find out some of the information about him. So he was said to be wounded at Gettysburg, in paper mills, a photographer. It mentions he worked in Windsor, lived in Windsor, Vermont, which connects to the back of the mount of the photograph. Lived in Brattleboro, which connects to the other newspaper article. Now, if you go look at the man's record, his service record, you're going to find out that he served in the 12th Vermont Infantry. That was a 9-month regiment formed in late 1862, and they muster out after the Battle of Gettysburg. If you go look at his record on fold 3, you're going to find that it's spotless. It looks like it was just filled in month by month just to have his name. And those of you who know the records know that there's a monthly muster report in these military service records. And his basically says, August, September, October, he's basically present for duty. Not a lot of information. In other records, it will tell you, let's say July 1863, wounded at Gettysburg. Well, we don't have that for him. So that raises some questions about the veracity of this newspaper obituary, because the newspaper obituary claims that he was wounded. In fact, it mentions a shell wound, a shell fragment in the leg hit him. But we have nowhere in his record that says that. So if you begin to dig into the history of the regiments, you're going to find that actually they were at Gettysburg, which on the surface sounds good. But then you read that they were in support. They were on detached duty guarding the trains of the First Corps. Now, the state historian of Vermont, provides that information. If you begin to read the details, because fortunately for us, the state historian goes on and he gives a bit more detail. He says companies B and G were sent forward as a guard for a portion of the ammunition train to a point on a Taneytown Road on the outskirts of the battlefield, where they remained during the fight of the third day of the battle. Now, that doesn't explain Harwood's situation, because he was in Company A, And so these guys are in companies B and G. But the state historian says, other members of the regiment on detached service participated in the battle. So it's not a locked, that detail isn't locked down. Nowhere does it say that he was wounded by a fragment of a shell in his leg, other than the newspaper article at Gettysburg. But the state historian of Vermont does reference other members of the regiment who participated in the battle. Possible. We can't rule it out. I can't say with 100% certainty that the article is 100% right, but it looks pretty good. We'll try to get more information on this once the National Archives is open. We'll take a trip down there and dig around and see what we can find. So Harwood goes on to move south after the war. He moves to Georgia and settles in the southern part of Georgia and Brunswick, Georgia, in fact. Opens up a photography gallery and a jewelry shop and remains there until 1876 when a yellow fever epidemic scares him and his wife away. There's a nice little quote. He says, "We left dinner on the stove, and so far as I know, it is still there, as we never went back." So he leaves photography behind. He goes back to Vermont, works in Massachusetts as a photographer for a little while longer, but then he goes to the paper mills and lives out the rest of his life. Now, a few months after I picked up the photograph of the young woman with the burnisher, guess what pops up on eBay? I saw this photograph and I thought, oh my gosh, it's the burnisher. That's my first thought. And it actually was that table, that table, that sort of rolling table, because it's so unique looking with the fabric covering. It's like, what else could it be? It's the same table and it's the same burnisher, only the young woman is no longer there. We now have this man sitting there. And if you look at the table, there's all kinds of good things sitting there. You've got, he's basically showing off his abilities as a photographer. We have a large oval albumen. We've got some cartes de visite. You've got bottles. You've got photographs, unmounted photographs, a little bit of everything. Of course, front and center here is also the full plate sliding box camera that was popular from the Daguerrean era through 1870s, George Whitley tells me. So what a wonderful connection. Now, we also have this man sitting next to it. Who is this man? You got to think, chances are good, that it's Harwood. Well, if we look at the back of this photograph, you're going to see that it says Great Falls, New Hampshire album. This is written by someone, a collector probably, in a more recent time, a more modern time. And up here, very hard to see in very light pencil, is a name. Now, if we take this into Photoshop and increase the contrast a little bit, it's pretty clear the name, A. Harwood. No question, it's A. Harwood. Now, that still doesn't really tell us that it's him. It sure looks good. But let's go back to the obituary that I shared with you, 1929. Back in that period, newspapers had started to do this. They started to understand that the front page of a newspaper, you could start a story, but you could jump it to an inside page. That way you could put more stories on the front. It's part of the evolution of newspapers. So Harwood's obituary jumps. That headline you saw, the Gettysburg, wounded at Gettysburg, 99 years old, that's a big flashy headline on the front of newspaper. It jumps to page 8. On page 8 is a photograph of Albert William Harwood. Now, if you put those two photographs side by side, resemblance is strong. So there you have it. You never know what stories are behind these photographs. And when I say that, I often am talking about the Civil War soldiers themselves, like Alexander Heritage Newton. But the young lady, whose name we still don't know, sitting with the burnisher on that funky fabric-covered table, she also helped to identify a Civil War soldier. So that wraps it up for another segment of taking a ride down the research rabbit hole. It also wraps up another episode of Military Images Live. So I want to thank you for tuning in. If you don't subscribe, and if you like this program, if you love this program, if you've been watching it, if you watch it here on YouTube, I urge you to subscribe and support what we're doing. It covers this program. Of course, it covers the magazine and other activities that we're involved in to use these photographs to educate and raise awareness and share the history of the country. So go to shopmilitaryimages.com, and here's my tip. Use welcome bonus. If you're a new subscriber, this is only for new subscribers. If you use welcome bonus, you'll get 50% off. All one word, all caps. Welcome bonus, go to shopmilitaryimages.com. I hope you do. We'll see you back here in a couple of weeks on a new episode. So thanks so much for tuning in. Happy hunting, happy research. Take care now.